Hello, everybody. We are so glad that you've made time out of your busy schedules to join us today for our Reframe and Refresh. Today's conversation is going to be on exploring global connections through Korean adoptees and teaching in China. And my name is Larissa Lamb. I'm the director of a film called Far East Deep South, which is about Chinese immigrants in the segregated South. And my pronouns are she, her, and I'm an Asian female with medium length black hair, wearing a maroon top with a teardrop chrome necklace, sitting in front of an orange and yellow background that says Reframe and Refresh and the New Day Films logo with my movie poster Far East Deep South. I am so excited about our panel today, and this is going to be a great conversation. And we encourage you to also share resources, but also ask questions of our panelists later on our conversation. We have Charles Abelmann, who's the director of English Hustle, Glenn Morey, director of Side by Side, Out of South Korean Orphanage and Into the World, and Dr. Joseph Ho, associate professor of history in Albion College. And this conversation today will be moderated by Deann Borshay Liem, director of Geographies of Kinship, and so many more films that I'll tell you about in a moment. Reframe and Refresh is New Day Films' monthly series for the education and filmmaking community to have refreshing conversations that reframe our perspectives. And I'm going to tell you just a little bit more about New Day Films. So for those of you who are not familiar with New Day Films, we are a unique filmmaker-run distribution cooperative providing award-winning films to educators, community groups, government agencies, public libraries, and businesses since 1971. Yes, we are over 50 years old, but we don't look it, right? And democratically run by more than 150 filmmaker members, New Day is committed to reflecting greater diversity, representation, and inclusion. And New Day Films have been broadcast on PBS, HBO, and other media outlets. And in providing over 50 years of dynamic and provocative storytelling, we have many filmmakers that have won Emmy Awards, Oscars, and we are happy to bring to you today programming two of our most recent titles, English Hustle and Side by Side. So before we get into the conversation, I bring Deann Borshay Liem to moderate. Let me just settle some housekeeping. If you're just joining us, feel free to introduce yourself and let us know where you're zooming from and share your favorite warm, hot beverage with us. In the meantime, please keep yourself on mute. We will have a time for Q&A towards the end of the session. So use the chat box for questions. Feel free to drop any questions along the way as well. Please be courteous in our chat box. We want to create this positive and affirming environment for everyone. And today's discussion is not meant to be an exhaustive one. In the limited time we have today, we hope to catalyze more conversation and spur more learning beyond today. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce your moderator for today, Deann Borshay Liem. Deann has had over 20 years of experience working in development, production, and distribution of independent documentaries. In addition to her latest film, Geographies of Kinship, she is producer, director, and writer of the Emmy Award-nominated documentary, First Person Plural, and the award-winning films In the Matter of Cha Jung-hee and Memory of Forgotten War. Deann served as executive producer for many other films, including Kelly Loves Tony, aka Dawn Bonus, and Breathing, the Eddie Zhang Story. She also served as co-producer for Special Circumstances of Burqa Boxers and a story editor for the Peabody-winning film The Apology. She's the former director of the Center for Asian American Media, affectionately known as CAM, and where she supervised development, distribution, and broadcast for new films for public TV. And she's a former Sundance Institute Fellow and recipient of a Rockefeller Film TV Fellowship. She's won many other distinguished awards, and we are so glad that she is here today. Please welcome Deann Borshay Liem.
Thanks so much, Larissa. It's great to be here with you all. Just a quick self-description. I'm a Korean woman with short salt and pepper hair, increasingly more salt than pepper, wearing a red shirt. And my background is an orange graphic that says Reframe and Refresh. And I too would love to just welcome all of you here. Thank you for joining us. It's great to be with everybody. We have a fantastic panel of filmmakers and experts today, exploring the global connections through stories of adopted Koreans and English teachers in China. What I'm going to do is first introduce our panelists, and then we're going to screen the trailers for English Hustle and Side by Side, then move forward with our discussion. Panelists, if as I introduce you, if you would each say hello and share your self-descriptions and say where you're tuning in from, that'd be great. First, let me introduce Charlie Abelmann, director and producer of English Hustle. As a filmmaker and an educator, Charlie has conducted extensive research on education in China and perspectives on US-China relations. He's interested in helping audiences understand complex education topics involving the global education market and cross-cultural issues. He's worked with the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians as an education planner and also worked with institutions of higher learning in Mississippi prior to getting his MA and his doctorate in education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He refined his understanding of international development field from his work as senior education specialist at the World Bank. There he supported education research, capacity building, and education investments in Uganda, Tanzania, Zimbabwe, China, and elsewhere. Our next panelist, Glenn Morey, is director of Side by Side. Glenn is a New York Times op-doc filmmaker and Audible author, and is half of a husband-wife filmmaking team, along with Julie Morey. Glenn is an inter-country adoptee born in Seoul, Korea. He lives in Denver and has enjoyed a 40-year career in filmmaking, brand development, content creation, and programming. He was executive producer for the documentary film House on Fire, Black America Responds to AIDS, which was on PBS. And the Moreys have been featured on NPR's Morning Edition, All Things Considered, and many other places. Side by Side won the Gold Jury Award for Best Documentary Film at the Social Justice Film Festival. It was also an official selection of the San Diego Asian Film Festival, Boston Asian American Film Festival, and many others. And in 2019, Side by Side was adapted as a New York Times op-doc called Given Away, as well as a 12-screen video art installation that showed in Seoul, Incheon, and New York City. And now Side by Side has been adapted as an Audible original titled Given Away. So that's all incredible. Our third panelist today is Dr. Joseph Ho, who is an associate professor of history at Albion College, Michigan, and a center associate at the University of Michigan's Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies. He's a historian of modern East Asia, US-China encounters, and transnational visual culture and media. Joseph is the co-editor of War and Occupation in China, The Letters of an American Missionary from Hangzhou, 1937 to 1938, and the author of his most recent book, Developing Mission, Photography, Filmmaking, and American Missionaries in Modern China, which was just published last year. And he's currently working on a new book, Bamboo Wireless, Mediating the Cold War in Asia. And he's also a photographer and collects antique cameras related to the historical eras that he studies. So thank you all three panelists for joining us today. Before we start our conversation, let's take a look at the trailers for both films, starting with English Hustle. Let me just give you a brief description. English Hustle explores the complexities of the multi-billion-dollar English online tutoring industry through personal stories with insights from academic experts on Chinese education, history, and foreign affairs. The film explores the power of cultural connections, highlighting the challenging gig work that teachers endure during a financial and political upheaval. So let's show that first.
What do you see?
Frog.
What is it? A frog!
There were over 100,000 American teachers teaching English in China.
$10 billion in venture capital money.
When I started, it was a job, but it became also who I am.
The Philippines has been a lot more amenable.
Hi!
Us teachers need to feed their families.
The communist government always viewed education as a battlefield.
Chinese media reporting a crackdown.
Private tutoring firms banned from raising funds.
All classes starting on August 5th will be canceled.
Teaching opportunities will slow down.
Like, people are really desperate right now.
We have nothing to eat.
Yes? Okay.
Language is culture, it's psychology, language is emotion.
We were moving into this ideal world of seamless connection.
我是中国人，何必学外文 ？I'm a Chinese guy. Why should I learn foreign language?
Thank you so much. And now let's go to Side by Side. Side by Side is an international journey through 9 stories of abandonment, relinquishment, orphanages, and intercountry adoption. The film explores what happens when children's lives are reset by adoption and sent to grow up in new countries and families of a different race, language, and culture. 9 adopted Koreans reveal a stark and often emotionally fraught journey representing decades of intercountry adoption.
Je ne sais pas combien de temps j'ai vécu en Corée. Simplement, j'ai été adoptée à l'âge de 18 mois.
I was born in 1984 and I was adopted to Tasmania in Australia in 1988.
My twin brother and I were adopted to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. We grew up there our entire childhood. Our adoptive father was Norwegian American and our adoptive mother was German American.
Så det jag vet från mina adoptionspapper, det är att när jag föddes så var jag yngst av 5 döttrar. Och mina föräldrar hade inte råd att ha kvar mig för att de var också tvungna att ha en son.
Somehow my grandmother's, giving me away to the stranger and I'm going somewhere. Of course I was scared. We were both crying. And, one of the last things that my grandmother said was, hey, when you grow up, come visit me. And that is very, very distinct. And it makes me emotional to talk about it.
Ik groeide op in Nederland met het gevoel dat ik echt een Nederlands meisje was. En zoals ik al eerder zei, je blond haar en blauwe ogen had. Ook al was dat niet zo als ik in de spiegel keek, ik voelde me wel zo.
And I was also experimenting with putting talcum powder on my face, which is like pure white, because I thought that maybe it was my skin color that made me different. And I think back and feel sad about that little girl that was doing that and struggling with her appearance in such a way.
Jag kunde, från att jag var ganska liten som barn, så kunde jag stå i spegeln och kolla mig så djupt in i ögonen och bara fråga, hallå, vem är jag? Är det någon där inne?
Basically, I grew up feeling like a Martian who had arrived from outer space in a spaceship. And years later, when I met other adoptees, it was like happening upon a convention of Martians and spaceships.
Thank you so much. Both films are so powerful, and I was moved by the protagonists in each film. And of course, as a fellow adopted Korean, found myself teary during Side by Side. Can't help it. I've seen it many times, but still got teary. So let me start our conversation first with Charles. Charles, you have just an incredible background in education. You've been a teacher, an education specialist. You've worked in policy making. What brought you to making documentary films, and what inspired you to make this particular film?
Sure. Well, when I was the director of the laboratory schools at the University of Chicago, I did a project with students. And we did a trip to China, 4 students from my school, 4 from an inner city charter school, and 4 from an elite Chinese school to retrace the educator John Dewey's travels in China 100 years ago. And it was a very heady trip with kids reenacting his speeches, And I wanted to make it less heady for students. So we decided that students would make a film about the trip and about themselves. And we partnered with a filmmaker, and I worked as sort of director and producer. And I loved the experience and loved learning by doing, which was one of the key phrases of John Dewey, and sort of got me hooked on filmmaking. I've always had an interest in US-China relations. I managed the projects at the World Bank in China. And I learned about these gig workers, 100,000 US gig workers and 40,000 Filipinos. I initially started to write an academic piece, and then I decided it would actually be more interesting to try and document their lives and their connection to their students through film. And I was really, when I started the project, thinking of an ethnography and thinking of the work of Studs Terkel and documenting different kinds of work. And that's how it started.
That's great. Thank you. I have to say, it really opened my eyes to this world of international, transnational gig work that I didn't know a lot about. So I appreciate that. Glenn, Side by Side is part of a larger project of interviewing 100 Korean adopted people who were adopted and also who lived in orphanages and aged out. Can you describe the larger project and how your personal experience as an adopted Korean influenced your decision to undertake this project?
Thanks, Deann. 63 years ago, I was an abandoned newborn infant in Seoul, South Korea. And I was found, I was placed in an orphanage, and 6 months later, I went from an orphanage in Seoul to a suburb outside of Denver. I went from Kang to Glenn, and from Kim to Morey. But there were actually 80 infants and children on the flight that took us to America. And there were many thousands that never got on a flight like that, all of which, for me, begs a whole lot of questions that are pretty personal, starting with why us? I mean, what happened to the other 80 kids on the flight? What happened to the other 180,000 adopted Koreans over 65 plus years? What happened to the millions who aged out of those orphanages? There's no single human story, including mine, that answers those questions and that helps us understand those 65 years. And that's why the Side by Side project presents many stories, 100 stories, Korean adoptees born between 1953 and 1998, who now live all over the world, as well as some who aged out of Korean orphanages. It takes many stories to try to fully understand those 65 years and to comprehend the full spectrum of adopted experiences and outcomes, to fully see the unadopted and their experiences, to broach the idea that how we as a society broadly think about adoption, is really very different from how adoptees have experienced adoption. Sometimes I refer to Side by Side as an oral history project. The history of intercountry adoption as it's been practiced since the mid-20th century, and a history that led to 1 million other intercountry adoptions. But to me, it's obviously not just a history lesson. To me, it's a message in a bottle to adoptees everywhere that their experiences and their feelings are not theirs alone, that they're not alone. To me, it's a message to adoptive parents that any adopted child, particularly a transracially adopted child or a child adopted from another country, certainly has different needs from their biological children and will need help in developing a different kind of identity. And to me, it's a message to adoption professionals and policymakers, and especially educators, that adoptee voices with broad representation are required to fully understand adoption and to support adoptive families and especially adoptees. So if this project is oral history, these storytellers are also the most critically important teachers of those lessons, with insight that no adoption agency, no adoption policymaker, no adoptive parent can provide.
Great, thank you for that. Both your projects have, you have 100 protagonists, which is incredible, from all over the world. And Charlie, your films also have participants from, several different countries, and they're all incredibly articulate, empathic, and just really open and generous with what they reveal on camera. Can you both talk about how you selected the participants, which must have been challenging? I mean, traveling to so many different countries and finding the participants, and talk about the opportunities and challenges of bringing kind of this global lens to these stories.
Sure. So in my case, there's sort of a genre of online videos that have been made by teachers about their teaching experience. They get made by teachers because teachers get paid in this industry both by teaching, but also by getting referrals. So teachers were regularly trying to promote the platforms that they worked on to be able to refer people and get additional income. So I was able to watch hundreds of videos of hundreds of teachers, both in the US and the Philippines, as well as digital nomads, to get a sense of who these people were, how they communicated, and try to put together a small selection to be able to follow. 2 in the Philippines, a digital nomad working from Bangkok, as well as Malaysia, and then a teacher in rural Indiana. To be able to get those 4, I initially casted about 15, who I reached out to, tried to build relationships with, explain the project, see if they were willing to participate. That got down to about 6, did some filming of all of those 6, and then from that settled on these 4. They were all incredibly generous with their time. They didn't really have any understanding of documentary filmmaking or expectations. And they let me into their homes to be able to build relationships with them, get familiar with them before being able to actually start filming them. It was during COVID, so it made it particularly difficult in terms of, in some cases, a lot of time in homes by Zoom and other modalities, but was able to really benefit from these 4 gig workers and their struggles as the industry collapsed. And when I started the film, I didn't know the industry would collapse. So it was much more about their work and who they were and their families and this ethnography piece. And then it became this really quite dramatic plot that was handed to me when the Chinese government regulated the industry and it all closed in pretty much overnight. So I was there with them through that emotional time when they lost their livelihoods.
That's amazing. It hadn't occurred to me that you had been filming during the pandemic, and the arc of when Chinese policies change and people do lose their jobs and the emotional connections are lost. It's quite dramatic in the film. Let me turn to Joseph. Joseph, as someone who has studied cross-cultural encounters in U.S.-China relations and visual culture, can you comment on why learning about these kinds of personal stories and histories is important to understanding and encouraging closer ties between Asia and the West?
Thanks, Deann. That's a really good question. I think I was thinking about the work that you all do in my own teaching. So thinking about my students and their perspectives. We often nowadays, a lot of our students, a lot of people that we know, our friends, our family, who don't have these connections with Asia or haven't been thinking about these in these terms, often tend to think about US-Asia relationships in monoliths, institutions, industries, trade wars, things that are, of course, all batted about by the media and larger institutional types of approaches. But as a cultural historian, as someone who's really invested in recovering how people's experiences are in history and in media, I find that recovering those voices is exactly what these films are trying to do. That we're going beneath the surface of institutions and large groups and stereotypes and essentially trying to illuminate communities that people don't really tend to think about because we're so, in a kind of popular culture ways, attuned to the big monoliths. And human experience, of course, is so much more complicated and moving and colorful than the ways that, again, a lot of ways that people that tend to think about these relationships. And I often kind of think about this way that we even talk about US-China relations or US-Asia relations, but what people mean by that is governmental relations. And yet we have communities and individuals and human experience that is all across this, that these films are really bringing to the surface. And that is what I want to give to my students.
That's a great point. I mean, because both of these films really speak to the human relationships, not so much governmental policy, but the human connections that people are making, via many borders and boundaries. Glenn, if I could go back to your film for a minute, did working on this film and spending time with adopted Koreans change your views on adoption itself? And was there something that surprised you in terms of the themes that emerged in the interviews?
You know, I often get asked if I've been surprised by the results of these stories. But to be honest, over the last couple of years, I've kind of come to dread this question because when I meet people at conferences or happy hours or dinner parties or screenings or whatever, invariably I'm asked this question: what is the most surprising thing I learned? And I do have an answer, but it's kind of a hard answer that doesn't really match what people want to hear about adoption. And going into this project, I had no idea that this would happen. But with nearly everyone I talked to, I found a surprising amount of pain associated with their adoption experiences. And this was no matter what their lives have been like. It was no matter if they were struggling with all kinds of life challenges or if they were highly accomplished, you know, with beautiful families and wonderful lives. Eventually, everyone talked about their adoption experiences in painful terms, painful memories, painful feelings that clearly had not diminished much over time. And that was very much a surprise to me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Can you say a bit more about why that was a surprise?
Well,
because
they weren't. Go ahead. Sorry.
You had certain expectations in terms of understanding the narrative of adoption and what adoption is supposed to, you know, the overall framework of international adoption.
Well, and I've heard this related by many adoptees, and so this is more than just my own feelings on this matter, but yes, I had the same kinds of experiences and feelings all my life, growing up and all the way to today. But I have been trained to keep those to myself, to keep those feelings to myself, because they don't match what people want to hear about your adoption, that it was a perfect blend of a family that needed a child and me that needed a home, that the sort of simplistic and reductive narrative here of love conquers all, that wasn't really enough to address the many issues that I had being in this country, being in this culture, being not part of a community that shared my race and ethnicity. So yeah, I think that essentially it comes down to this. When I asked nearly everyone in the interviews how much they had told other people of what they had told me over the previous 30 to 60 minutes, the universal answer to that was not much. Not much to spouses, not much to friends, not much to parents, not much. Because those are the kinds of stories that we've been taught to keep to ourselves. Otherwise, we run the risk of hurting people, we think, or of being what somebody might call ungrateful.
Yeah, thank you. It's complex themes. Yeah, I appreciate your answer. I guess for Charles, similarly, did working on your film change your perceptions at all in terms of your thoughts about US-China relations? And was there anything that surprised you about either the geopolitics or the personal impacts of online educational labor?
part of my original curiosity was that you had these millions of relationships between teachers and students that were unregulated at a time of really horrible US-China relations. So at the macro policy level, you had, high confrontation, which still exists today. But at the micro level, you had these really meaningful relationships. And that's what I wanted to sort of probe. While the film focuses on the teachers and one of their students, I did interviews of a number of other students and their families. And the power of these connections between students and teachers going into each other's homes through Zoom or other platforms, and how deep that connection became was really powerful to see. In just, in some cases they met 100 times or 200 times or 300 times. And while it was about language and language teaching, it was much more than language. It was really both sides learning about each other. For these teachers, many of them went into this because they needed money. They could have gone and been an Uber driver, or they could have gone and become an online English teacher. And it's a group in general, many of whom haven't traveled a lot, don't have passports, hadn't been to China. And as they got connected to these Chinese students, their parents, their grandparents, it became much more than a job for them. It really became a body of work and livelihood that was based on relationships that were quite powerful. And for the students and their families, very powerful relationships with these teachers, exchanging notes, exchanging gifts, trying to be able to meet each other if there was a trip to China by some of the teachers, which happened, in that depth of relationship. Many of the Chinese students and their families were not willing to be filmed, in the same way that the CEOs and founders of companies weren't, and in the same ways that investors were not. There is an incredible fear related to how this topic gets given attention, particularly since the crackdown happened of the double reduction policy and a time of incredible nationalism. Yesterday, in fact, the Chinese government passed a new law on patriotic education that will go into be implemented in January. So at this time of nationalism, on one hand, which is pulling countries apart, you have these individuals who really want to have and maintain and sustain relationships.
Yeah, I have to say that was one of the things that surprised me about the film, the deep emotional connections and kind of the informal communication that was happening between the teachers and the students, and including the teachers, including their children, and just sharing a lot of personal sharing. That surprised me. That kind of is beyond what I thought would be kind of a teacher-student relationship. And it made me wonder what's happening to them now. So maybe at some point we'll find out. Joseph, both of these films show the lived experiences of ordinary people caught up in kind of these larger social historical processes, not really under their control, but that obviously impact their daily lives. Can you talk about the role specifically of image making and filmmaking in communicating these experiences across international borders?
So a term that I used when I was thinking about my own research with missionary film specifically, but filmmaking across the Pacific, was this thing called a 16 millimeter bridge, because that was the film format that people were using. And it's a bridge that allowed people in disparate parts of the world to both not just see each other, but to think about each other in some kind of connection or community with these disparate parts of the Pacific. And I think there's this idea that I really like to think about, or at least present to my students, when we consider media and documentary film and the act of making these types of films and images. We consider, of course, the maker, the subject, and the audience. But with all of these three kind of categories, the word that comes to mind for me is in-betweenness. The idea that people are asking themselves and thinking about their images and presenting themselves as in between worlds, and asking themselves, who am I? And what is my community? and where can I present myself, or how can I present myself, whether as a filmmaker or a subject of a film or an audience member of a film, in relation to the experience of being caught between worlds. And I think of that because as a Chinese American person, and in different questions about my own identity, when I go to China, I am an American. When I'm here in the States, I'm presented as Chinese, and there's these questions about who am I and what world do I belong to. And I think that experience of in-betweenness is part of how these films build bridges and then complicate and provide light into how human experience is constructed and complicated.
I love that. Thank you. Thank you. That's wonderful. I'm gonna keep that in my brain. And I love the idea of the 16 millimeter bridge. In both films, there's sort of a highly visual component to both films. In Charlie's film, we see the gig work being mediated by the internet and teachers using props, and they have a presence on YouTube and social media. And the social platforms have kind of an aesthetic themselves. And in Glenn's film employs a very specific aesthetic, kind of a direct-to-camera storytelling. And, that provides sort of this counter narrative to what we normally hear about adoptee lives through adoption agencies and governments and so on. Can you share, I'm just curious about your observations about kind of this visual narrative culture, kind of, I guess, the visual culture of these sort of transnational spaces. That's to you, Joseph.
Sorry, I missed that last part. I was reading the chat box as comments were coming in, as one does.
Oh, yeah.
So if you don't mind repeating the last part of your question about the visual culture.
Yeah, your observations of the visual culture of the transnational gig work that is conveyed, obviously mediated by the internet, but also that have a kind of a distinct aesthetic, with teachers using props and the platforms themselves having kind of unique visual kind of graphics. And then Glenn's film as kind of a direct-to-camera storytelling that is sort of a counter-narrative to what we normally hear about, the adoptee experience. I'm just curious about your comments or what your observations might have been in terms of the visual culture of these kind of transnational spaces.
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. I apologize for missing it earlier. But I think part of it is two parts, I think. One is that for Charlie's work, this idea that community is built through devices, that devices are the mediating points between people and their experiences, and then this other larger meta device of the film being that device or media that allows people to see into the worlds and these relationships that are being constructed through devices. The reason why I think about that is because, as Deann mentioned earlier, devices like this were the types of things that connected people and imaginations historically in the work that I do. And I often think that we live in a world surrounded by technologies. Like right now, this community that we're in at this very moment is being mediated by visual devices, and connected, of course, to English language teaching. And this experience is something that is both physical and imagined. And I think when I think about Charlie, your film, that it is really about how these communities are coalescing and trying to bridge the gap, even through a screen, even through linguistic difference and cultural difference, to create that community. And certainly with Glenn, your film and the ways that you present this is that direct-to-camera approach is breaking down those barriers and allowing us to have this conversation almost, or hear these narratives directly from people who have been, thinking about this, wrestling with these experiences their whole lives. And I see that when I do, oral history collection, there's no way that one cannot sit in front of someone and hear their story and hear all of these levels of this experience and not be moved by it. So I think, Glenn, in what you're doing, you're providing people the opportunity, the privilege to be part of a conversation, to hear these stories and recover those voices in a way that kind of breaks through the device and breaks through the barrier of the film. And that, for me, speaks to, again, what this film and what visual culture does to make these experiences visible.
Me, what was powerful about Glenn's film is the fact that you really focus on the individual and their emotions, and you're not distracted by, you know, what their house looks like or what their office looks like or what the outside context looks like or their profession, but it really centers on the individual story and voice, without those other ornaments. So it gets, which is really powerful, you know, and in my film, that broader lens and context was so important for me to be able to show in some ways, particularly my two female characters, the similarities and challenges they had with their kids having to take care of themselves, their kids having to occupy themselves, you know, the challenge of being a working mother, and being able to see that was so important. So I think this speaks to this sort of, you know, the differences in power of very different styles to convey narrative.
I certainly appreciate your comments on those methods. You know, the thing that we were really trying to achieve with this project is to fully democratize the filmmaking process. For example, we filmed everybody in every city that we went to, everybody who volunteered to be filmed. We did not select anyone. We only filmed 100 stories, and we included 100 stories in the project. And when we filmed them, we did distinctly decide to democratize those subjects by virtue of the plain background, so that you couldn't tell who had spent the vast majority of their life homeless and who was a successful brain surgeon or something like that. And then lastly, we decided to go with that direct-to-camera approach simply because we felt no better way to fully realize the impact of these stories that had never been related to other human beings than to do that eye to eye and to allow the audience to experience those stories in exactly the same way that I did in the studio.
Yeah, thank you. Can you each talk about the impact of the film thus far to the different audiences that you've brought your films to? Just curious what the response has been, and if you've been part of an impact campaign, or how you've brought the film to different audiences.
Glenn, you want to go first?
Sure. You know, the collection of oral histories in the Side-by-Side project are really unprecedented, and the film is intended to be an introduction to that and representative of it as well. That's how we chose the various excerpts for the film. But it was really intended to be an introduction to the larger project, as you spoke about, Deann. So essentially, this body of work was so valuable, as it had never been done before, and likely to be done again in the same way, in the same scope, in the immediate future. And so we felt a real obligation to find as many ways to get to audiences as we could possibly find, which is why we've always considered the project to be multi-platform, meaning not just a short film, but also an immersive website and searchable website on the internet. Not just a film, but a series of videos, you know, on partner media channels, taking the audio and creating an audible book, making it available to the audience of the New York Times with a different adaptation. So we worked very, very diligently over the last really 6 years to find new audiences and new ways to expose audiences to these incredible stories.
Thank you.
So
Charlie?
I'm trying to reach both the US and China audience. You know, there's obviously millions of people in China who can connect to this story. And what's been interesting is press targeted at the Chinese have gotten interested in the film. So on the US side, Voice of America had interest, South China Post. The difficulty is for this film to be seen in China, unless someone has a VPN, there's certain parts of it that just can't get through censorship. So I continue to sort of make cuts of this and trying to get it positioned to be able to be seen in China, but that means taking out parts on the Cultural Revolution, it means taking out parts on Xi, it means taking out parts on the former US ambassador to the US, who now is sort of vanished from the diplomatic senior corps in the Chinese government. So it's raised real issues about, you know, censorship and what it means to have this film be seen. But there's also creative ways for it to be seen and sort of packaging it more as an education dialogue and showing it to Chinese as part of a seminar where they're able to see it with captions and discuss it. And then it's not sitting anywhere permanently that gets censored through AI tools or human intervention. On the US side, my hope really is to have it be shown where there's interest in global competencies and global citizenship and what does global citizenship mean. OECD in Paris now has created a new national exam where countries are comparing students on global competencies. And how do you foster global competency and using the film as an entry point to talking about global citizenship.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you all of you. Fantastic conversation. I see Larissa has joined us, and I think we're going to take a quick moment for a message about New Day.
Yeah, well, this has been an incredibly enlightening conversation. I know we're starting to get some questions in the chat. So please, if you've got a question and want to ask it to any of our panelists or all our panelists, please drop it in the chat. In the meantime, while you guys are populating the chat with some questions, I'm going to make a few announcements before we get to the Q&A. We have wanted to show you that New Day Films, besides English Hustle and Side by Side, which are featured today, we have a variety of ways to stream our diverse collection of films, including ones that deal with Asia and the Pacific Islands, as well as Asian American studies, international relations, and global studies. You can visit our website at newday.com to see our collection of diverse films. Also, I will be sharing the links to the films and other resources that have been shared in the chat with everyone who registered via Eventbrite. We'll be sending an email out after the event is over in the coming week. Also, follow us on social media. If you are not following us, we are on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter, X. We haven't quite updated our icon yet, but feel free to follow us on social media. And we're dropping those links in the chat as well at New Day Films. And oh yeah, we're also on LinkedIn, by the way. So feel free to connect with us there. And we wanted to provide the links in the chat as well of our films, English Hustle, which is available on New Day, and Side by Side. And for those of you who use Canopy, English Hustle is available on Canopy, and Side by Side will be on Canopy very soon, in fact, possibly this week. So we will update you also through email. If you haven't signed up for our newsletter on our website to get updates on this event and others, please do that as well at newday.com. And if you happen to be a filmmaker in the house and you're interested in joining New Day, or you know a filmmaker who might be interested in joining our filmmaker cooperative to distribute their film for education, our next information session of how to join New Day and submit a film is November 1st, next week at 11 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Pacific. And we will provide the link in the chat as well to go to sign up for that webinar, or you can go to newday.com. And I'm going to turn it back over to Deann for the question portion.
Great. We've got a few questions coming in through the chat. One of them is about Korean adoptee filmmakers. In the past year or so, I've been introduced to a surprising amount of Korean adoptees working in documentary. Curious if anyone has thoughts about why so many of us seem to be pursuing this medium. Glenn, would you like to respond?
Well, I think that we are sort of the tip of the iceberg in terms of adoptee voices coming to the conversation from a writing standpoint, books and papers and research, coming to the conversation in terms of fiction and narrative film and of course documentary film. And I'm so excited to see this wave of adoptee voices coming to the conversation, because I believe that is what it takes to change a public narrative and to provide nuance to a public narrative. So I think that the reason it's coming to the forefront now and really over the last 10 years is because we had to get older. So we had to get to the point in our professional careers and our abilities and our capabilities to the point where we could create this kind of work. And because Korean adoption was the first adoption program intercountry out of the gate, we were the ones that got older first. And so we were able to reach that point in our careers where we could make this kind of work and put it in front of audiences.
I agree with you. We did have to mature as a community. For everyone, can you each talk about what you're working on currently and how people can follow your work?
So I'm currently working on two things. I'm working on a film on an outsider artist from Cuba by the name of Waya Khan. He's in his 90s and has struggled with mental illness over the course of his life, and using his life as an entry point to looking at sort of the challenges of Cuban artists. And then I'm doing a project with the World Bank, which is a short documentary narratives of people who have struggled to get their IDs and birth certificates. And there's 1 billion people in the world who lack identity. And one of the Millennium Development Goals is around everyone having the right to a birth certificate and the right to an ID. And I'm supporting the World Bank's work in trying to document how that takes place.
And our work continues. Oops, excuse me.
I was just going to say, Charlie, how can people follow your work? Is there a chat?
LinkedIn is a good spot to keep an eye on me, and the English Hustle website as well.
Okay, great. Thank you. Glenn, go ahead.
Well, our work, Julie and my work, continues to be very side-by-side focused. As I said, we're working hard to get these stories further and further out into the world. And of course, our number one priority for this project was adoptees, adult adoptees in particular, who needed to hear these kinds of stories. Adoptive parents who are in the process of creating family out of adoption and many kinds of adoption and need to hear these kinds of stories to fully understand the lived experience and the future lived experience potentially of their children. Adoption and mental health professionals that find themselves on the therapeutic end of this process where they're confronted with these kinds of stories every day and need to be as qualified as possible to deal with those stories. And of course, higher education, where we see such a tremendous need for more adoption qualified professionals in virtually every area and every expertise that deals with adoption.
Great, thank you. Joseph, do you want to talk about your upcoming work or the research you're working on?
Sure. So my last book, Developing Mission, ends in 1949 with the kind of separation between American and Chinese communities as missionaries leave and communities change. But I was always wondering what happens after, what happens next. So the next book is really to trace what happens with diasporic communities of Chinese communities, people, including my own grandparents, because I've been searching for my grandparents in almost all of the research that I've been doing over the years. So the next book is really going to be about what happens when communities move and media moves from mainland China to Taiwan to Southeast Asia, and recovering, again, those types of voices and images, including 84,000 photographs that we just found last year that were made in Taiwan between 1950 and 1979 by a single person. And that'll be part of the next book, Bamboo Wireless. And I'll put my website in the chat box if anyone is interested in following. But this has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. I look forward to your next book and all of both Glenn and Charlie's continuing work. I believe we are coming to a close. Larissa, do you want to come back and do a wrap up?
Yes, and I know we weren't able to get through all the questions today, but thank you, panelists, so much. We are going to be emailing everybody who has attended and registered the link to this panel once we have it up on YouTube, and as well as the resources shared. And, we also encourage you, if a question didn't get answered today, to reach out to our panelists through our New Day websites or through Albion College. I know, or Joseph has left his website on there too. Feel free to reach out to them directly with any additional questions you may have. But thank you again for attending today's event. We just wanted to let you know that we are going to be having our next Reframe and Refresh on December 6th. So please save that date. It's going to be a conversation around labor and strikes and labor movements. We're going to be featuring two of our newer films, Haymarket the Bomb, The Anarchist, The Labor Structure, as well as When We Fight, about the LA teachers strike. So we hope you will come back and join us then. In the meantime, don't forget to follow us on social media. And again, thank you so much for attending today. And once again, Deann, Charlie, Glenn, Joseph, you were an amazing panel and a fantastic conversation. Thank you again on behalf of New Day Films, and we will see you next time.